Hi, and welcome to today's SFPE webinar on Solving for Why, Grenfell Tower 3 years on. This is Louis Garazzi, SFPE's Director of Professional Development, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Before we get started, I'm going to go over some information in regard to the webinar logistics. First, all participants will receive a certificate of attendance for 1 PDH. To receive a certificate, you must stay online for the entire webinar. Certificates will be sent out via email in about 1 week. Also, we do not provide copies of the speaker's PowerPoint presentation. However, we will be posting a video of this presentation on the SFPE YouTube channel and website in the next week. Additionally, you can ask our speaker questions by writing it into the webinar dashboard. You may ask a question at any time. However, we will not be taking any questions until the end of. Today's speakers are Neil Gibbons, Daniel Lemieux, and Nick Ozog. Neil's 37-year operational fire service career spanned all roles from firefighter to acting chief fire officer. His career commenced as a firefighter in Derbyshire, where he progressed through the ranks to become deputy chief fire officer in Devon and Somerset Fire and Rescue Service, following the successful merger of the two services. Neil was lead officer for fire protection within the UK Chief Fire Officers Association from 2007 to 2013. Since moving on from the Fire and Rescue Service, Neil has been president and CEO of the Institution of Fire Engineers. He was chair of a national working group set up to improve product safety recalls and is supporting the industry-led competence work as a member of the steering group and secretary of the Fire Engineers Working Group. Neil has been awarded the Queen's Fire Service Medal and is a fellow of the Institution of Fire Engineers. Dan has been with WJE for over 20 years and is a registered architect in 5 jurisdictions within the US, a listed architect with the Royal Institute of British Architects in the UK, and holds licenses in Ontario, Canada, and New South Wales, Australia. Dan currently serves as chair of ASTM subcommittees E06.55, Performance of Building Enclosures, and is vice chair of ASTM committee E06, Performance of Buildings. His experience includes over 25 years of professional practice in new construction design peer review, performance testing, and overseas supply chain design assist, and technical support for building enclosure systems and assemblies in the US and abroad. Nick joined WJE in 2016 and has more than 10 years of fire protection and engineering experience. Nick has a wide range of experience in building and fire code analysis, combustible facade review, for both new and existing buildings, property condition assessments, fire testing, performance-based design and risk management, and his experience includes domestic and international clients with global experience reviewing buildings with potentially combustible facades. So with that being said, welcome Neil, Nick, and Dan.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and Louis, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who's attending, and special thanks to SFPE. We have, Nick, I think you have control of the slides. So we're going to, just to set the table a little bit, we really, the opening of this presentation is really just to set the table for Neil and for Nick. Neil in particular, who's going to update us a little bit on where we are in terms of regulatory reform in the UK. But we'll start with a little bit of background, a little bit of history and evolution about how we got here. And then we'll finish with some discussion about sustainability, cost, and risk. So obviously fire in our built environment, this has been in the news for several years now. In fact, depending on how far back you want to go, several decades, the fires in the UAE probably garnered the most attention, even though we had loss of property there, not necessarily casualties and loss of life on the scale, certainly of Grenfell Tower. Grenfell Tower, of course, because of the loss of life, I think, has generated a lot more discussion and a lot more serious discussion about what we need to do in terms of education, regulatory reform, how we deliver buildings in our built environment. And of course, Notre Dame, which is a whole different topic, but certainly introduces the idea of landmark buildings and structures and the impact that some of these issues can have on those properties. This is just a snapshot of the history for those of you who have done a little bit of research on this. And Nick and I have spoken in Malaga and in Rotterdam to this group, to the SFPE group, on some of this history. This really underscores what I mentioned a moment ago, that all of this is happening. All of these issues are driving product development, design changes in design, changes in building codes. But of course, when we arrive at Grenfell Tower, things pivot a little bit. We have a much more serious situation as a consequence of some of the issues that some of these other fires generated and put on the table for us. Certainly as design professionals put this on the table for all of us. Grenfell Tower, initially, just to take a step back, this was some of the initial reaction to Grenfell Tower. We were there just on other projects and getting involved in different types of work in London when this happened. And you can see some of the headlines, not surprisingly: public outcry, grief, mourning, a lot of questions and a search for answers, in particular among design and construction professionals, regulatory administrators, again, everyone involved in real estate development, design, and construction. How could this happen? And what can we do to mitigate this risk going forward? The industry response, very quickly, this was the manufacturer of the exterior cladding panels at Grenfell Tower. The response, not surprising, from the manufacturer in terms of pulling back a little bit, pulling product back a little bit, taking a deep breath, trying to understand what happened at Grenfell Tower. And again, how can we make changes to address that? And what can the industry do? A lot of our material science expertise resides in the industry. So there's a keen interest in the industry to help respond to this. Regulatory response, and Neil will talk a little bit in more detail, obviously, about this. This was some of the initial response. We had an immediate effort by the BRE in the UK to take coupons or small samples of some of the cladding panels and determine the combustibility of those materials. Of course, the focus went quickly to ACM panels with polyethylene cores and that type of thing as fuel for this type of fire. They convened an expert panel. Everyone took a step back and realized that it's not just the exterior cladding, it's the insulation, it's the design of a rain screen cladding system itself and how it contributes to propagation of fire inside that exterior wall. So you had an immediate response because of the public outcry, a step back with experts to try and understand this in a little more detail, and then right back out with a variety of different efforts to try and solve the problem. We have with this website link, and some of you have probably been there already, the BRE undertook to publish different systems and materials that have been tested in full-scale assembly tests to try and educate the population about where this was and what action they were taking in response to Grenfell Tower. So how do we educate? This is a snapshot from the US. This is the accreditation board requirements for colleges of architecture here in the States. And you can see in some of the areas I've highlighted, the accreditation requirements touch on just about everything that we're going to talk about today: life safety systems, building envelope systems, fire protection, material selection, performance of materials. The question is, are we doing enough here? Is this, when we look at how buildings actually perform, whether we're talking about heat, air, moisture transfer, microbial growth, or in this instance, fire, combustibility of products and materials and propagation of fire, are we doing enough at the university level to educate? And then more importantly, after folks are in practice, what are we doing to try and make sure that the individuals involved in project delivery have enough knowledge and expertise to really make a difference in this. And these are some of the areas that we're pursuing on parallel tracks with universities to try and understand and help them understand where this curricula should go to help address some of these issues. And again, are we doing enough? When we look at the US and to some degree in the UK, when we look at project delivery, design, and construction, we understand that there is a bit of a failure to educate on building physics at the graduate and postgraduate level here in the US. As I mentioned a moment ago, the topics are there, but the emphasis that different universities place on those topics will vary widely. So what can we do to bring that into alignment a little bit and make sure that we're delivering a consistent level of education on some of these issues? And then first principles in sustainable design, understanding, particularly with material selection, that it's really more than climate specific, climate driven, renewable resource driven selection of materials. We really have to understand how materials are going to behave in all different circumstances beyond climate. Compartmentalization of the design profession, this is a bit of the diagram we have here. When you think about property loss, when you think about litigation, the consequences of litigation and property loss, the architect of record is always in the middle of that. We've seen some litigation here in the States where suddenly the sustainability consultant is being held to a higher standard because they've weighed in and made recommendations to the architect of record on installation products, cladding materials, that type of thing. If they're not fully understood and vetted by the architect, or they're just accepted, you can introduce problems onto the project. And of course, the fire protection engineer, we do have the one case in Australia, I believe, where suddenly the fire protection engineer is in the crosshairs in litigation for some of the decisions that are made during design and construction. So all of this interrelated and all very important. The last piece I'll mention is we are moving from over-design to efficient design. So super insulated buildings, we can't simply over-design mechanical systems anymore to overcome condensation potential. We're looking for energy efficient buildings and structures, and so we need to think more carefully about some of those decisions that we make to really have an impact and to try and mitigate some of the risks that we're talking about today. Minding the gap, this is a couple of things to think about. Building enclosure commissioning here in the US, this is a response to some of the challenges that I just spoke about. This is basically a private sector response to project delivery, where we have a qualified or competent person in charge of a building enclosure commissioning process during all of the phases of project delivery that you see here, to ensure that we have competence and accountability throughout that process. When you think about what Neil will talk about here in a couple of minutes on the regulatory side, this is a similar response from the UK. We have what they're referring to as the golden thread. And again, the emphasis here is competence and accountability. How can we make sure that the right people are at the table at the right time in the process to make smart decisions about where the design is headed, where the construction is headed, and more importantly, from the perspective of the UK and where Neil will focus, when we introduce a layer of government to help understand and address some of these issues, how do we educate that layer? You know, that's the important piece. When we have people responsible for monitoring this process, we need to create on a parallel track a way to educate that group. And that's precisely what this is. This is the challenge. When we want to create this layer in the context of regulatory reform on a parallel track, we really have to think about education at the university level, training programs, education and training after you're in the practice. We have many, many practicing design professionals, real estate professionals who need some access to this type of education to address some of these issues. So how do we do that? Do we engage universities? Do we engage standards development organizations? how can we create this framework where people can get the education they need to properly administer this process. And so with that, I will hand it off to Neil, who's going to go into a little bit more detail about regulatory reform in the UK and where we are today. Neil?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Lots of interesting questions posed there, and I hopefully got people thinking already. I want to take you on a short journey, setting out some of the background about what we've discovered that's failed in our system since Grenfell, and then focus heavily on the proposals to perhaps put our house in order regarding competence. But you will be seeing on your screens now a picture of Dame Judith Hackett, ex-leader of our health and safety executive, brought in by the government to review the whole system, to look at building regulations and fire safety. And we'd sort of got to that opinion ourselves already, that what we had was not fit for purpose. We were all shocked to the core that we could have tall buildings covered in this material and such a lack of compliance with the building regulations. But Dame Judith dug in and identified some of the underpinning problems, the unclear roles and responsibilities, ambiguous and inconsistent code. She suggested a regulatory system that was confusing, competence across the system is patchy, voice of residents unheard. The government didn't just bring in Dame Judith to look at the failures in the building regulations side of things. Sir Martin Moorbeck is running a public inquiry. I'll mention the first stage of that. The Metropolitan Police in London looking at the potential for charges for manslaughter and the criminal side of things. The government departments, two of them, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, alongside the Home Office, who between them have responsibility for fire safety standards and fire law enforcement, set up a building safety programme. And in the last few weeks, we've had announcement of a new building safety regulator, which is going to be a wing of our health and safety executive. Lots happening. Next slide, please, Nick. So, should we have seen this coming? It was 1872 when we had the last fire in the UK on the mainland that killed more people than Grenfell. We had had a period of sublime success. We'd seen fire deaths going down year on year for around about 20 years. All through my career, our work with fire prevention, the proliferation of smoke alarms, the headline figure that fire services were measured against, the success of our fire system, was all going the right way. We were going down from over 1,000 deaths per year in the UK to around about 300. But then, if we just lift our heads and look across the world, the terrible similarities between the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in 1911 in New York and the Tazreen Fashion Complex in Dhaka, Bangladesh in 2012. The world hadn't moved on, but some parts of it possibly had done. We in the UK looked across at the fires in Australia and the Middle East and thought, oh, they're using that sort of cladding, but that must be something to do with their insulation requirements. It couldn't happen here, but hey ho. Next slide, please. Martin Moorbeck listened to everyone that was called, over 500 respondents, and came to a conclusion at the end of his first phase of the inquiry that Grenfell Tower's exterior facade did not comply with building regulations. He also had some strong words to say about London Fire Brigade and their stay put advice to the residents on the night, and suggested that things could have turned out differently. But our element in my certain focus since the fire has been about the competence and how did we end up with this system where no one in the system is required to be competent. Next slide, please. The Swiss cheese analogy, those of you that were in Malaga will have seen me use this example before, and quite a few learned people around the world are recognizing that we need layers of defenses. We need several slices, several attempts to prevent a tragedy. But on that night in Grenfell, we had a fire break out in the lowest occupied floor, giving it the opportunity to travel up the outside of the building and cover and encompass more floors. It broke out just after midnight, when most people would have been in deep sleep or heading that way. So many things going wrong on the same day. The first warm night of the year, and windows been left open. I've not seen any scientific analysis of the impact of that yet, but just one of those factors. Fire service dealt with the incident inside the flat very, very quickly, and we've identified what the cause was, but a tragedy that has really brought the spotlight not just on tall buildings used as flats, but on the UK system of providing for fire safety for people. Next slide, please. This presentation was put together for a conference in New Zealand that was going to be around performance-based design, and my colleagues, the other speakers from the US, amended my slides to read performance-based building regulations and performance-based fire regulations. Over here in the UK, we talk about goal-based, but it's the same thing. It's about setting targets, setting objectives, and not being prescriptive. But I needed to point out that it's not just our building regulations that are goal-based or performance-based, and our fire regulations for occupied buildings, but our fire cover. We've gone from a system of having a prescribed attendance time to a local agreed risk management plan that means that actually it could be 20 minutes before a building of a type in a certain area gets the attendance of the fire service. So the whole of it is performance-based, but that is intended and is supported by Dame Judith. And Dame Judith really caught the moment by saying, if we move away, if we go back to prescription, as soon as we pass standards, they will be out of date. But that's assuming, and I go on to the second part of my slide, that we are benefiting from the flexibilities of the performance-based system. Prescription brings certainty. The performance-based or goal-based system give us flexibility. And if it does give us flexibility, are we using that flexibility to bring us the innovation? And does the innovation actually lead to improvement? Is it making places safer? Or is it just helping us build more quickly? Or is it all about cost? Is it just about reducing cost? The environment here in the UK has been 40 years of deregulation. It's been the light touch. It's been the market-led approach. And we've had 10 years of austerity. We can see that actually our flexibility may well have been abused. Next slide, please. So, Dame Judith, whilst some of this has been replaced by announcements from the government department, which actually firms up what Dame Judith recommended, I'm going to use 3 slides that capture the essence of what Dame Judith thinks that we should be doing. First of all, she suggests we need a new regulatory framework. We've had a historic division between the construction phase, the design, and the occupied, and no one looking over the whole. We did have, for a period, we had an inspector of fire services, a magistrate's inspectorate, that looked at the performance of the system and fed into building regulations. And back in the day, when people had time and capacity, that was okay. But most of that's been removed, and we're now left with a situation where actually we know that the system's broken. They're bringing in a new building safety regulator with 3 responsibilities, one of them to be an overarching body looking at the whole system of safety in buildings. A mandatory incident reporting mechanism. So if you're in a building that falls within scope and you're responsible for managing that building, if something goes wrong or one of a number of issues occurs, then you'll be required to report to the regulator that something has gone wrong. We should know more about failures rather than waiting for them to just add up to a disaster. Rigorous and demanding duty holder roles and responsibilities, I'll come back to that. A prime move from Dame Judith that has been completely taken up by all of those talking about a better future is that at the minute you can actually build a building in England without gaining approval from a building control body and without anybody checking that the building's safe before it's occupied. Our public would never believe that, but it's true. The building regulations have been full of holes, and Dame Judith has recommended, and the government have bought the idea, that there should be gateways, that no building of consequence should be built until plans have been approved, and that the building shouldn't be occupied at any stage until it's been checked by a relevant body. The gateways will go further than that, but in essence, just to put that level of control back in, where the person that specified the building, the person that's laid out the money, will not be able to get any return until it's been signed off by a relevant body, is going to put immense pressure on it being completed properly. And that sort of tension has been missing for a long time and is greatly welcomed by my colleagues in the field. The stronger change control process, substitution of materials, deciding to do something differently that's not on the plans will not be allowed. It will be a matter of reconsulting and rechecking, and a single, more streamlined regulatory route. It will not go from the planning committee to the building regulations body to an approved inspector to the fire service and back again to the building control and back to there will be one body that will oversee the lot. Next slide, please, Nick. Rigorous enforcement powers. I have to say that we've got enforcement powers for the fire service in terms of enforcement in occupied buildings, but the teeth have been removed from our building regulation system for many years. Powers are there, they have to be used in a very short space of time after the erroneous building work's been completed, and have frankly never been used because we put competition into the building regulations approval market. We haven't had clear and identifiable duty holders. Is it the builder's responsibility to build a safe building, or the designer to design it safely, or the person putting the money into the project? We've had some success in the construction design and management regulations, identifying principal duty holders. Hackett suggested extending that, and the government has fleshed that out into us recognising a principal designer, a principal contractor, and a building safety manager, and they'll carry the can through the lifetime of a building from concept to demolition, and it will be recognisable which body could be sued if they're not discharging their duties responsibly. Which brings in the clearer rights and obligations for residents. People have been living in buildings and oblivious to safety. In fact, quite well, they should have been able to, because if everyone had been complying, we'd have had very safe buildings. But since Grenfell, there's been obviously a backlash and a great deal of concern that residents have not been involved, have not recognised that changes to buildings have actually put them in jeopardy, and that is going to change. The regulator for the whole building I've mentioned, and one of the key nuggets for me, an overarching body to provide oversight of competence. I think the next slide goes into competence in a little more depth, so I'll save that comment. Going back to Hackett's list, the ownership of technical guidance needs to sit with industry, but there should be an organisation that overlooks that prescribed by government. And we have the Building Regulations Advisory Committee, but they should be informed by the industry's best brains about what works. Regulations have been complex. I have some difficulty with this concept. I've yet to find the dummy's book for brain surgery, and frankly, building is complicated. Managing buildings to make them safe from fire is complicated, and our guides, our British standards, our building regulations approved documents are not meant to be read by the man or woman in the street. They're meant to be read by competent professionals, and maybe the blame lies with the fact that we haven't required competence. There's concern about the products that we use in construction and whether they're clearly labelled and whether we can trace where they've come from. And back in the day when we were building everything out of bricks, blocks, plaster, cement, and inert substances, it wasn't such a problem. But today, with CLT, mass timber, and the range of plastics that have to be used to achieve the insulation elements, then life has sure got far more complicated. It shouldn't be beyond the wit of man in today's world for us to have a digital record of the design concept, who did what in the building, in the construction phase, and give some transparency for the responsibility and actually the design knowledge that needs to be transferred forward to both the construction and to the occupied phase. And Hackett said that we should ensure continuous improvement and best practice learning by being associated with international bodies. She did say international body. I don't know what she got in mind, whether she thought the SFP could answer all the world's problems, but there's certainly great value in what we're doing today in bringing the world together to talk about and share our problems. Thanks, Nick. Next one. So I talked about the UK system being performance-based or goal-based. I'd like to focus on the goalkeepers. In the past, we've relied on goodwill of professionals believing that we had a building control system that controlled buildings, believing that we had the fire service enforcing standards in all buildings. But in reality, from the architect to the people dealing with the procurement, to the contractors building the building, to building control testing the quality of building, to the responsible person managing the building, the risk assessor, or whoever was enforcing the fire safety order, not one of them in UK law have required to be competent. The example to contrast that I usually use is the controls applied in England over food safety. Every single person employed in the food industry that touches food as part of their business is required to have a food hygiene certificate. It's quite basic, it's not rocket science, but it applies a level of control that increases the chances of hygiene methods being applied and working successfully. But we allow anyone with a brass plaque and 4 screws to call themselves a risk assessor. We've got architects that do 4 hours training out of 7 years of learning on fire safety issues, designing and expecting someone else to pick up the design shortfalls in the process. The potential going forward is for us to apply some new controls, particularly for buildings that will be in scope of a new piece of legislation, to ensure that all of that thread is dealt with by people who have the relevant competence for the role that they're taking on. Next slide, Nick. I think I mentioned this before. Hackett said that competence across our system is patchy, lack of formal process for assuring skills at every stage of the life of high-rise residential buildings, and we're behind other parts of the world. Prefer not to focus on that, but that's what she found. Next, please. So the professions came together under the auspices of an industry response group, creating a competence steering group with 150 organisations coming together that have currently invested about £7 million worth of resources, over 30 meetings now in just about 2 years, creating 14 working groups, engaging over 300 people, and produced a 600-page interim report. Competence is complicated in construction. It's divided into 14 clear threads, one of them being the overarching test of competence for all bodies, but from designer through to approver through to auditor, we've looked at every element. We're requiring certain key threads in all of the people that will work in safety significant roles across the buildings that fall within scope. We need some kind of accreditation. We need these people to have evidence and shown and been tested that they are competent, they have got the knowledge, they can apply that knowledge, they maintain their knowledge through CPD, they operate within an ethical framework that requires them only to work within areas to which they have expertise, and that at some point they come up for re-registration, they don't get a ticket for life. We see that in England operating in our health environment. We have protected roles for doctors, dentists, nurses, paramedics, all being required to be members of a relevant body that checks that not only have they passed the appropriate degree, but their peers have looked at them applying that knowledge and looked at how they maintain their knowledge. Again, it's not rocket science, but it's just never been required in fire safety and in the construction industry. Next slide, please, Nick. So my energy for the last 2 years, the primary role has been to help the group looking at fire engineers. Now, in 1918, the only fire engineers in England were firefighters. Chief fire officers got together and created a little organisation called the Institution of Fire Engineers, but they were the only people, apart from some people designing sprinkler systems for commercial risks. Fire engineering was left to the fire service. But in the last 30 years, we've seen fire engineering, fire protection engineering, fire safety engineering develop as a standalone profession, and people studying directly into degrees and being employed specifically as fire engineers. To help organise where this fits into the jigsaw of safety of a building, what we needed to work on in the fire engineers working group was what is expected of a fire engineer. How do you identify a competent fire engineer? We're certainly interested in them operating ethically. We need them to maintain their knowledge. We need a system of re-registration and a means of sharing safety critical information. Some call that whistleblowing, but we have other systems. But today we have no requirement for that, but the working group has worked through proposals. Next slide, please, Nick. We haven't gone alone on this. One of the other threads that Dame Judith identified was that we needed all engineers working in the built environment to raise their bar as well. And because in the UK, we work under license from the Engineering Council, that's our overarching body that sets the standards for registration at engineering technician, incorporated engineer and chartered engineer level. And working with them, we're trying to build up towards implementing a process where there is mandatory CPD that's equivalent and valued across all of the engineering professions, that we all adhere to a code of professional conduct, and that we all have access to whistleblowing, guidance and support for whistleblowers, and protection for people to ensure that we can learn from each other. Thanks, Nick. The proposal is that the new duty holders, the principal designer, principal contractor and building safety manager, should only appoint professionally competent fire engineers to carry out safety critical work on in-scope buildings. The scope that we're talking about hasn't changed. We're talking about residential buildings over 18 metres tall or over 6 floors. But the intent and expectation is that once we have a register in place, that all the professionals will work to that standard, and we wouldn't expect other people to be operating. It should become de facto standard. And I heard Dan mention that he's a member of the Royal Institute of British Architects. They craft the standard platform that is used for managing the plan of works through construction, known as the RIB plan of works. They were introducing a fire cut to that, an overlay that looked at fire, and we were encouraging them to recognise that the fire engineer should be brought in not only at the design phase, but actually needed to be maintained through all the relevant stages to enable competent sign-off, so that what the fire engineer built into the strategy has actually been delivered. And the findings that was also that the Institution of Fire Engineers should continue to support the structural engineers system that's been in operation for 15 years called CROSS. I know that CROSS has just extended to the US, highly valued here in the UK. Over 1,000 reports have been submitted over time, and that's a means of the industry feeding itself to learn, to share near misses, events or concerns with a safe independent body that can share that knowledge and make sure it gets to the right places. I better speed up a bit, Nick, haven't I? I'm looking at the time. Next slide, please. To manage the competence that I talked about, we're looking at an independent competency body that will bring together all of the various threads and ensure that the frameworks that are designed by each of the different professions actually delivers what is needed, and particularly from my perspective, make sure that the fire knowledge is appropriately profiled within each of those roles. Next slide. In a nutshell then, the Building a Safer Future proposals introduce a new layer of transparency, a golden thread of information with duty order accountability running through the three gateways. There'll be accountability with a new national building safety regulator, and enforcement with civil sanctions against those companies, and potentially criminal liability against individuals who fail to abide by the standards necessary. Next slide. The new national building safety regulator, my US colleagues have added in the orange statement there, the safety czar. That's not a term we often use in the UK, but we understand the meaning of it. Yes, we need a focus. We need someone that looks over the performance of our system, that can look at how we can improve the system, that looks to see that the system's actually working and identify developing areas of concern in any direction, maybe over provision, maybe little indicators that things are starting to go wrong before they become disasters. And within this, we recognise that this body should encourage independent third-party review. We have to lay ourselves open to be analysed by the best in the field, and that way we should encourage us all to get better. That's really my messages in a nutshell, that the fire safety is in our hands. For the first time in my career, we are very much focused on fire safety. We've been accepting and understanding that the previous generations have made a good job of fire prevention, but our world has been shaken by a disaster. And from that, it's really important that we continue to share learning. I would emphasize that we need to standardize our language and data, and very much embed fire safety lifelong learning. Look forward to receiving your questions at the end if you've got any. Thank you for listening. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you, Dan. We're going to make a quick pivot to some of the issues that may come up in conducting a performance-based design or evaluation when looking at building enclosures specifically, whether that be sustainability, cost, and then associated risk, and some available tools for the fire protection engineer, building enclosure consultant, expert when evaluating risk. First off, it's important to find out what an acceptable risk is. Oftentimes, this includes working with the clients themselves, especially when dealing with evaluating existing buildings that may have combustible facade materials on them. Better understanding the acceptable risk is important, is oftentimes a fire safety, fire protection engineer can have direct impact on the building enclosure, and working with building enclosure expertise to understand how the fire safety concerns may affect sustainability, energy code requirements that the building enclosure also has to meet. Along the lines of managing the risks themselves, as we've heard from Neil about accountability throughout the process of the building life cycle, managing that risk includes looking at not only the design and specification writing, but also through the submittal review process potentially, and actual construction, and then the life cycle once that building is in use. Oftentimes this includes evaluating the materials themselves, especially if there is a value engineering aspect to the job, or a proposal to switch out the individual material, to look at how that may affect the overall fire protection and life safety objectives of that building, especially when performance-based design is evaluated. A holistic renewed approach should be reviewed if material substitution is proposed. So example, really quick for some example organizations and maybe an introduction to international fire safety standards, just from what work is being undergone in the world. Launched 9 July 2018 in a meeting of the UN Economic Commission for Europe. The International Fire Safety Standards group was proposed. This group is supported by SFPE as well, and it's essentially to create common principles that can be used globally to increase fire safety concepts and awareness throughout the world, to hopefully adopt holistic approach and a framework both for new and existing buildings. Excuse me. Along those lines, part of the work that group is proposing to use is common principles. These common principles are prevention, detection and communication, occupant protection, containment, and building and life cycle systems. Along those lines, the life cycle of the building is through the design, construction, and use throughout. And then in particular, some concerns that Neil's brought up with buildings in the UK is adaptive reuse and repurposement of historic buildings, and potentially reclad or overclad of existing insulation or existing buildings to increase the energy performance. Along those lines, as we've heard from Neil as well, is accountability throughout the process of the individuals in charge, whether that be comprehensive competency, quality assurance throughout the life cycle of the building, reviews of those processes, and then who is that responsible person or persons throughout that process. Some examples of available tools for the fire protection engineer include fire safety risk assessment within the UK, several NFPA documents, and the SFPE engineering guide for risk assessment and fire protection design. Some of these tools, including NFPA's effect tool, specific to building enclosures, and review of potentially combustible facades specifically on existing buildings, include a risk evaluation and an understanding of, is that risk acceptable. This often includes interaction with the client to understand their risks and what they deem acceptable or not, and then an iterative process with the building enclosure expertise. Within the NFPA effect tool, there's effectively 3 tiers broken up into 2 parts. Part A is essential review of the building enclosure itself. And then part B is more the review of the fire protection life safety systems within the building themselves. Oftentimes, if a building, especially an existing building, is deemed to need further review, one would move on to tier 3, where tier 3 is an integration of the building enclosure as well as with the fire protection systems in that building itself. For fire protection engineers, NFPA's 550 fire safety concepts tree can be of benefit to show the integration and overlap and layout of a fire protection strategy for a building, whether that be existing building or a new building. First off, we'll start with the prevent fire side of the fire safety concepts tree, where working with manufacturers, building enclosure experts, and fire safety engineers can evaluate how the fuel can be controlled. Here's a brief example of different materials subjected to a material test. For example purposes, this is courtesy of Kingspan. You can see how different insulation materials may burn and behave differently when subjected to fire. Along those lines, there's also formal product testing that a manufacturer may undergo when evaluating the system itself, whether it be an individual product or assembly test. Focusing on an individual product test that a manufacturer may be able to conduct on their own. This is another example of two different composite material panels being subjected to a flame, courtesy of Kingspan. From a facade fire risk standpoint, the panels look very similar, but the core material is significantly different. As you can see later on the bottom, on the image on the bottom, it's a polyethylene core, and flaming droplets of the core material start dropping down. This can be of specific challenges to fire safety engineers, building enclosure consultants, and then in the event of a tragedy, firefighters themselves, as fire may spread downward via the flaming droplets. Along the lines, getting back into the NFPA 550 fire safety concept tree, if one is reviewing different materials that may be somewhat combustible or combustible in their building enclosure, it's important that we can no longer, as fire safety engineers, look at saying that a fire will not start, but we look at what would happen if a fire starts and trying to manage that fire, whether that be through control of the combustion process, suppressing the fire, or control of the fire by construction. Focusing on controlling the fuel again and how that fire may spread or the combustion process, there are many assembly tests. For a global comparison of those different tests, there's 4 presented on this screen. Most of them use visual observation and thermocouples to identify if a test is passed or failed, have different fire sizes that are used to evaluate the different facade materials and assemblies. And then somewhat unique with the FM test, for example, is that test is also done under a cone calorimeter and can be to provide heat release rate information. Courtesy of Thomas Bellwright is an example of an NFPA 285 fire test. Along these lines, again, it's additional paneling, examples of how this test can be conducted and what the observations are if one has not seen one of these tests. The firefighter just now has activated the burner at the front to further simulate flame leaving a fire compartment that would have occurred in an uncontrolled compartment fire. Again, a past NFPA 285 facade assembly. Along the lines, also courtesy of Thomas Bellwright, is an NFPA or BS 8414 fire test. This test is slightly larger in height and has a return wing wall, which will change the radiation effects onto the facade itself. And again, these are done visually and through thermocouple observation, whether the test is passed or failed. In this case, this is an example of a facade assembly that has also passed the BS 8414 and BR 135 criteria itself. Furthermore, within the NFPA 550 tree, managing the fire impact managing the exposed can also be an option. This is viewed more within existing buildings, either if you're dealing with some unique historic structures, for example, it could be limiting the amount of the exposed, perhaps offering guided tours, and then safeguarding the exposed on the other branch, whether that be defend in place or move the exposed out of the building, for example. Oftentimes when doing a holistic evaluation of an existing building with that may have combustible facade elements, part of managing the exposed is reviewed and looked at to see if improvements can be made. And lastly, to tie in with many of the aspects that both Dan and Neil presented, where throughout this process, whether it be an administrative action for how that building may be managed, or how working with different jurisdictions, the clients involved, educating the user is imperative, and education and competency throughout the process, as both Dan and Neil discussed, is important and should be looked at further. Along those lines, to tie in with what Neil talked about, sharing and learning, standardized language, the fire safety is in our hands, and oftentimes SFPE offers many useful guides and helps fire safety engineers around the world reach, hopefully reach higher, and through the IFSS that SFPE is a member of, maybe one day we'll have more globalized standards and common terms for conducting holistic fire reviews and fire safety of existing buildings and new buildings as well. Thank you, SFPE, and everyone for listening today. Very much appreciated, and hope everyone's safe.
Great. Thanks, Neil, Nick, and Dan. We do have some time to take some questions, only a few minutes, so let's get right to it. First question we have here is, starts off with a little commentary. Over the years, there's been, have had some observations and differences between vertical access, how vertical access is protected in the US versus the UK, for example, stairway enclosure protection. Has this event changed the design approach in the UK in any way?
Shall I take that? My knowledge is no. There's been a lot of pressure from some people who wanted more prescription to say that we should have got 2 staircases in all buildings over 3 floors, or other quite broad statements. But at this moment, we're in the process of looking again at our building regulations, and the efficacy of the enclosure itself, if compliant, is not under scrutiny.
Okay. The next question we have is, to what degree do you think the performance-based design approach led to the Grenfell disaster?
Neil, do you want to start with that, or?
Right. I can't say that it was an intentional part of a performance-based design process. No, let me put this another way. Performance-based design requires competent and ethical designers to apply their knowledge to the design, and then for that design to be checked by independent ethical scrutiny. And I think it's evidence that that's not taking place, and it's not just Grenfell. It wasn't just a one-off. We've got hundreds of other buildings with similar kinds of cladding facade situations. So it's a systemic fault, but I wouldn't lay the blame at all at us having performance-based design. In fact, I'm completely with Dame Judith that performance-based design is the only way to go if you don't want to see your standards stuck in history.
Great. The next question we have is, has consideration been given to changing UK standards to require sprinkler systems in residential high-rise?
Shall I take that one as well? The recent consultations come out from government indicating that they're going to require sprinklers down to 11 meters in residential buildings. that is a byproduct of the lobbying that's gone off. I completely support the use of sprinklers. What I have to do many times is remind people that sprinklers will not solve all problems, that we cannot forget about the rest of the safety package just because we've got sprinklers, but quite clearly they are very successful when installed and maintained properly.
Great, and we'll get one more question in. So a comment from an individual over at WPI stating that they have, a FPE program there, and also starting to teach with architectural engineers. Could you expand upon your vision of teaching professionals?
Well, from my perspective, which is the fire protection engineering side, having the opportunity to work with building enclosure expertise and consultants when evaluating buildings, whether new or existing, focusing on building enclosures, combustibility of materials. I think the more integrated education can be, the better off. I think through sound fire protection engineering, building enclosure, reviews, consulting, because the energy code also needs to be met by these building engineers, working with material scientists, manufacturers themselves. The more integrated and holistic that any process can be done, starting at the university level, I'm in favor of on a personal level. And then through some of the aspects that Dan talked about earlier, through the building enclosure system process, BECX, there's a somewhat defined process there that's already established for how a building enclosure could go from design through commissioning and installation on a building. And I think that's one way fire safety engineers, fire protection engineers can get more involved with the construction process to make sure that we meet the fire safety and life safety goals of both our profession, individually, our clients, and then society as a whole.
And I would echo obviously what Nick has just said and what Neil touched on. There are a couple things what from an architectural perspective, imbuing at the university level undergraduate and graduate students in architecture and engineering with some of these issues, bringing these things a little closer to the surface and kind of a holistic view of the enclosure in this instance, which is what we're talking about. Building enclosure commissioning is more of a, for practicing professionals, what we're trying to do is create a certification that you can obtain, training, education, certification. Neil touched on a lot of the things that enclosure commissioning will bring, continuing education requirements for that service provider, that type of thing. So we're trying to reach practicing professionals, or in the context of the UK, if we have government authorities who are responsible for this knowledge and policing, if you will, these issues, that they have a way to get the education and training after they're in professional practice. So those are some of the things we're working on a parallel track.
Yeah, I think it's credit to SFPE for the amount of CPD opportunities that I've seen disseminated at local and international level, and I'm really glad to be invited to be part of that. Thank you.
Great. So we do have a number of questions left, but we are past the top of the hour. So we'll forward these questions on to the three of you and just ask that you respond to it at your convenience. So just before we end today's webinar, I just want to thank everyone who participated, especially Neil, Nick, and Dan. Great presentation, and wishing everyone safety and well. Thanks.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Thank you.